of the ABAP Programming Model session. So originally it was just planned for one session, but since there was high demand, we repeated the session today. So thanks for joining the session. My name is Marcel Hermans. I'm a part of the ABAP platform team, and I'm taking care for the programming model in ABAP with regards to building Fiori applications in the S4HANA context. So today we are going to speak about the programming model. For me, the programming model are all technologies, tools, best practices, documentation and concepts that are required in order to build an application, so a Fiori application. So there were a couple of other sessions as well that are related or were related to the session here. So the session you are actually joining now is the overview lecture about the programming model. But we also had hands-on sessions. So who of you joined such a hands-on session for read-only transaction applications? Okay, thanks. But also end-to-end stories about testing and authorizations, and also with regards to OData version 4. So these topics I will also touch very shortly, but we mainly focus on the core of the programming model. So therefore the agenda for today is first of all a quick introduction of the product qualities which we want to achieve with Fiori applications in S4HANA from a programming model perspective and what it means for a programming model because it has an impact, the qualities we want to achieve. Then we go a little bit more into detail regarding read-only applications, what's basically the architecture, how comes CDS into the game, and how are Fiori applications actually created. And then the little bit more challenging part is about transactional support. So how are we going to implement transactional applications with logs and having state and all that stuff in a RESTful world? And then we go along these different cross topics, like I mentioned earlier before, testability, security, or authorizations. And at the end, I will give a rough overview about the future, where we are going further with this programming model, which we discussed today. So product qualities. So when we talk about product qualities, we have three different topics. The first topic, obviously supported with Fiori, is the look and feel, the user experience, which we want to achieve with Fiori. The second topic is about cloud qualities. And the third topic, which we also want to support in future, as well as we did it in the past in the other platform, is about supportability, lifecycle, and things like that. Like performance tracing, the transport management, and all that stuff. We do not want to harm it just by introducing a new programming model. We want to keep it and improve it also in the future. User experience, you can also say it's about look and feel. And if we have a look on the look, then it means that you can also change the look of the UI technology which is existing by just rendering it in a different way or changing CSS style sheets, or like you know maybe about visual harmonization, how we can render a little bit more smooth the SAP GUI or Web GUI applications or transactions. But when it comes to the feel, like the feel of a modern web-based application, we are not that good with, of course, SAP GUI-based application transactions, for example, or we want to do it in a better way by using Fiori based on UI5 technology, and we want to achieve new qualities we are not able to achieve with other technologies out there. So one thing is, for example, the role-based approach. So probably all of you know it much better than me. So in the past, especially at SAP, we created big transactions, having a lot of features, and then for the end user, only 10% of the transaction was relevant because the transaction evolved, and many more features were integrated into this transaction, and the very good end user knew which 90% of the transaction he can ignore because it's not relevant for him. So because there were just tons of features and not relevant for his specific role. Therefore, the approach with Fiori, and this is exactly how we also work in S4HANA, is to create more applications, more apps, which are specific for the different roles that want to work with the system. So for example, if I have a sales order with, I don't know, 30 nodes with 20 actions like decline and accept and all that stuff, I do not want to bring that all to one UI, but I just want to bring the specific data and the specific capabilities of the transaction, of the application. I want to bring that to the end user app. So this changes with Fiori very significantly. And we have other qualities, which I call draft qualities, because draft is a solution to achieve these qualities. It is about continuous work. So imagine you are device switch. Imagine you are in the morning sitting in the bus and you want to start working because you have something in mind. You don't want to write it on the paper, but you just want to enter it via an app on your mobile, and then you can maybe start. But obviously you cannot save the data because you will not reach a consistent state when the bus stops, and you want to go ahead in your office, on your PC, on your desktop, you want to proceed your work. So then you switch the device, and of course when you're sitting there and you're working like 2 hours, and then maybe your boss comes to you and says, well, do you have 5 minutes? Well, then was it not maybe 5 minutes, but 3 hours, you come back and then everything is gone. So in both, that means the switch of the device without having the data actively persisted, so that it's process relevant, and also this continuous work. This is something which we want to support here, which we do support, as we will also see in a live demo later on. So other things are collaboration. This is maybe not the 90% case, but also for specific apps mainly really interesting. So far we do not support it, but from a technical point of view that's with our architecture possible, that we say, yeah, so I have a student, so maybe he should start entering all the data, and I just review the data afterwards with my user, and I activate the changes, and then they're in the system. Effective and efficient work with data, that's basically where we want to make use of the HANA powers, for example in the list report, that we can do a real-time handling of the data with text search and with paging and with all the capabilities HANA offers for the default list reports use case, for example. And regarding cloud qualities, it's now very challenging because well, if you on customer side, you have your system landscape and you can plan your downtimes over the complete company, and in order to upgrade your system or to apply some patches, you can plan that over across the whole company. But in the cloud, of course, we are talking about scalability, elasticity, and especially also about availability. So we cannot shut down just the cloud. Cloud's not on now, so this is not possible because we need a high availability landscape. And therefore, it is really important for us that on a specific application server, we are able to upgrade the application server or to apply patches. We can only apply patches or upgrade an application server if no ABAP session is currently running on that, because otherwise all the end users would get a timeout of the session and that was it. That's not possible. Therefore, what we want to achieve here is to avoid the server stickiness. That means that the end user transaction, which is not really a transaction but an app now, that this is running independent of the application server, and that it can also change the application server dynamically. So this is what we understand with the server stickiness or avoiding the server stickiness. So summarizing that, it means that we somehow, for this role-based approach, have to support redundancy in applications, because like I said, we might have now with the sales order one business object, one big business object, but we might have dozens of applications running on that, and we don't want to have redundancy in the data or in the functionality. We just want to have all the validations for the sales order just once, which is reused for all applications, for all apps on top of that. And of course, if we are talking about HANA, we want to have an intrinsic support of HANA features, which comes for free as long as we are using the default programming model. So we want to have that for free when it is appropriate. Extensibility is basically some key concept which we need to support in our programming model so that it works end to end, because we also don't want to have like a development project for 1 month just in order to have a new field in an app, but this should be possible within some minutes, done by a single person who actually does not have really technical skills to implement something, but that a simple tool, a key user tool, you might have joined also the key user tool sessions, that a key user can also use a Fiori application to add a single field to an application from the database up to the user interface without any kind of implementation for that. So, but what does it now really mean for us? How does the concrete architecture look like? You probably saw these slides also in different sessions. So, for example, in the ABAP roadmap session. So, on the right-hand side, we see the ABAP stack coming from HANA to the application server, to the ABAP server with SAP Gateway as implementation for OData. Then we have different ways of how to implement an OData service. So, one way is using our programming model for read-only and transactional scenarios, and of course we are using SQL as a protocol towards OpenSQL to the HANA database. So then the interesting part on UI5 level is that we have there three different kinds of implementation flexibility and different productivity, development efficiency. So you can, for example, use UI5 in a freestyle mode, or maybe also some other UI technology, where you can implement freestyle, whatever you want, and you are the only person who decides how the application looks like at the end, how the app looks like at the end. But in order to have a little bit more development efficiency, we offer now with Fiori elements also the smart controls. That means you don't have to implement each and every value head on your own and each and every table on your own, but you can use, for example, smart tables or smart filter bars, which are reuse components on UI5 level to have some default implementation. For example, similar to the ABAP list viewer, where you have also reuse components which you can use and you don't have to think about that on your own. And then the third step is, you say, well, it's a normal application pattern, I don't want to invest here a lot in the creation and implement the overall app completely, but I'm using now smart templates, which is a pattern in the Fiori elements where I can say, yes, my pattern is like in the AUV, I have the selection field, I have the table, the list report, and when I click on a single item in the list, then I go to the object page with edit support or without edit support, and this complete pattern is then automatically supported by smart templates. That means you have on top of OData, freestyle UI5, reusable smart controls, or completely pattern-based approaches, like you also have with Software Manager, for example, based on like Web to ABAP. In the backend, it's very similar, but then we have just two approaches. One is again freestyle. Gateway offers you some code exits, the MVC or DPC extension classes. Who has worked with Gateway based on Service Builder, for example? Okay, thank you. So you can implement the OData APIs by using, for example, the Gateway Service Builder, which generates an APIs you can then implement by your own. Or you're using our default implementation based on CDS. That means CDS is then the data modeling language and also supporting the database access, and especially for the read-only scenarios, and we are using BOPF, the Business Object Processing Framework, for the transactional part. Who does know the BOPF framework? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Who knows what a business object is or understands the term business object? Okay, cool. Come to that later, shortly, but I was just interested in that. So we have CDS, which is a SQL-like language to define SQL views, for example, on the database coming from ABAP. But if this is not sufficient, we also support then breakout scenarios where you can use more advanced HANA features, which of course cost also a little bit from development point of view via ABAP managed database procedures, where you can use an ABAP SQL script, but then orchestrated coming from ABAP with ABAP lifecycle management and the type system. So now, what is CDS in detail? In the ABAP application server, the classic way, you have the SE11, where you can define SQL views with some capabilities. You can, for example, implement some joins. Since 1-2 weeks, I always mix it. I don't know. Either you can support inner joins or left outer joins, but not the other way around. And you have very good support for the ABAP lifecycle management and the ABAP type system. So you don't have to take care about the database on that level at all. We have the DEDIC as the one and only catalog to define the things which you need, and then ABAP and DEDIC and OpenSQL do the rest for you. Now with HANA, we had a lot of new innovations. HANA offers different types of views. So for example, attribute views, where you can have the text search, or calculation views, analytical views, cubes and all that stuff. And they have all their specific capabilities. You can of course use them also. And then if you go to the HANA Studio and then you think, okay, but how can I now touch them in ABAP? And then you are creating external views to have a proxy to these views. Then you're using HANA transport containers so that you can manage the lifecycle with the HANA content based on the ABAP lifecycle, and it gets more and more complex. And therefore we thought we need urgently a new technology which is from a conceptual point of view independent of ABAP, which is CDS. It's a SQL-based, SQL-like-based approach to define artifacts. It's also available in HANA, but here we are talking about ABAP CDS, and here we can define SQL views via advanced view building capabilities. And the good thing is that these CDS views, that they are basically ABAP artifacts, and we are just using the same lifecycle management and transports and the same type system as we have it in ABAP. So, and how does the end-to-end stack look like? So we have the ABAP application server, which gets a GET request in OData terminology or HTTP terminology from the app in order to read the data. And with CDS, we have now the data model defined, which defines also the database artifact. But we also have a default implementation for sorting, filtering, text search and paging, so you don't have to do that by your own, because once we know that we have a CDS artifact, we can implement this automatically in a generic way. Then we also allow UI annotations. We come to that later, but we do it here and not somewhere else, which influences the Smart Template UI, the Fiori Elements UI, either the Smart Controls, the reuse artifacts, or the Smart Template, that means a complete pattern. We have the data constraint language, which is basically a CDS-like syntax where you can define your authorizations. So the idea is that you don't define your PFCG objects, and you have to keep in mind which PFCG objects are relevant for which table or for which view, but you can here link the CDS view to this authorization, so for example also to a PFCG object, and then you don't have to take care anymore about that. And OpenSQL always knows I can use this constraints for the user authorization, for the instance authorization. And what we also support here via CDS are extension views, so you can very easily define new elements to an existing CDS artifact, or you can easily introduce new associations. We come also to that later. So, but what about the annotations now? CDS basically defines a core set of syntax elements to define the data model and how it is related to the database. And everything else, all the semantic on top, is currently always defined by annotations. Currently is also something we come at the end of this session to. And we also define here the UI semantic. That means here you can maybe read it, metadata, allow extensions true, and if this annotation is there, then I can define another artifact, which is the metadata extensions. I can then define UI semantic. Why are we doing it like that? Because we very often get the question, well, you are defining UI semantics, obviously for the UI. Why is it not part of the UI? Or why do we have it in the backend? The answer is, since it is UI technology independent, we don't want to have it on the UI side. Of course, I can also define semantic. So, concrete example, sales order ID should be the first column in a list report. The semantic is independent of each UI technology. The same if I define an UI5, I do to ABAP, AAD, or whatever. We want to have this UI information independent of the concrete technology, not implemented in JavaScript, but declared in or defined in a declarative way so that we can reuse it for further UI technologies as well. Therefore, it's important for us to bring this UI semantic, which is then used by this smart UI, more knowledge, then you can be smart, to render the UI accordingly. So, therefore, we have two channels. One is the $metadata, which uses the app to render it for the basic information. And then we have this UI semantic, which is provided in a different resource, the annotation file. So second step is, okay, now we have it in the back end, but what about layering? What about if if sales defines now the sales order and they define some certain UI layout, and now we have like industries, globalizations, we have partners, customers on top on a layer approach, and we want to refine it. Therefore, we have a layering support of these UI annotations, similar to the WebDim Pro ABAP configuration, where we just have different layers reflecting the different contributors, and then we have a merging algorithm that brings all this information together so that you have at the end of the day what you expect. And that's the reason why we don't add these UI annotations in general to the CDS view, but that we define it in the CDS Metadata Extension. So it's not a completely new concept, it's just a different artifact where we can mention the elements which we define in CDS, and I can add annotations as well. And I can define the layer where these annotations belong to. Then you can ask, okay, maybe it makes sense to have them in the backend, but why should the backend developer now decide how the UI is rendered? This is a task of the UI developer, not of the backend developer. And therefore, the last step which we want to have, and this is a big disclaimer, it's the planned innovation, planned feature, is that we have what you see is what you get editor in the web IDE, and that the outcome of this editor is then this metadata extension. So you maybe have this patterns, these smart controls, smart templates. You have an editor, you can drag and drop, sales order is the first column, okay, and then you can put a button and then push a button, and then this information is then persisted in the backend, but not locally in the app, so that we have all this layering information also in the backend. So then the right persona, the UI developer, is then responsible for defining this UI layout. Yes, please?
From which version is the separate metadata files available?
So the question was for which ABAP NetWeaver release is the separate annotation file available? The answer is I'm not 100% sure 750 or 751. But CDS, we just started in 740, and annotations, UI annotations, we started in 750, and I think it is available also in 750, but I'm not 100% sure. But if you want to have a really 100% answer, you can just drop me a mail, then we'll find out. Of course, questions are always allowed, so you can also have a more interactive session here. That's no problem. If there are no further questions, then I would come to the first demo. So now we are going to our design time, which is ABAP in Eclipse, the ABAP development toolkit. And we have here prepared a CDS view which selects data from the sales order item. So we define here a new view which is called sales order item 01, and it selects data from some other CDS view which was prepared here by a different organization, which is for us the EPM team or the EPM examples. So what is actually the task I want to do? The task is I want to have a sales order item analysis app where I can see for different companies the different sales orders and the amount which is reflected in the different sales order items and sales orders. Therefore, starting point, I just select the key fields, which is the sales order ID and the sales order item position, and I expose them as keys here. And I denormalize now the company name of the customer of the sales order. And here we can see that there is a path. The underscores indicate that this is an association. This is a convention we have internally at SAP. So I can navigate now from the sales order, which is basically this or me here in this case, and I can navigate to the sales orders, that means the parent, and from the sales order I can select the customer, and from the customer I can now get an element which is, for example, the company name. And this is another innovation which we have in CDS. It's about associations. You probably know associations from UML or ER diagrams, so it's the same thing here. We just have named join conditions. So we don't have to keep in mind all the reference, key references between the different tables and to put it on the wall, how they are connected to each other and which fields to connect where, but we have it here automatically supported. You just define once the association with the join condition, and you can reuse wherever you want in CDS or also in OpenSQL, this association then. So now I have the CDS view, I press F8, and then I see the data in Eclipse. This data is in the system. I see the sales order item, and the company name, which is quite boring because we actually want to have a Fiori application on top of that, so an end user would not be happy to use Eclipse. So therefore, first thing we need to do is we need to create now an OData service. So we have now something in ABAP where we can touch HANA to get the data, but we need to expose it to the UI via OData, and therefore we have this very short way of defining it via this annotation OData published true. And once I activate this CDS view now, all the gateway-related artifacts are created, so we don't need to use here for this simple scenario the gateway service builder, which would also work, the gateway service reference data source concept, but we just use this shortcut via OData published true. Here in my case, because I'm running in our systems in the cloud, the service is automatically published or activated. If you would do that on a premise system, you would have to go to the front-end server and to activate it, so the customizing step, and to activate it there on your own. So here I can now see the OData service, and if I click on that, I can also see, for example, the $metadata file. And we can see here, maybe you are better than me in reading XML, but for me it's pretty hard. I can just, for example, see here the key definition for the sales order or the sales order item, which are exactly the fields which we defined here. So this is now the mapping from CDS to OData, for example. Please.
Your comment just made me think, do you have a tool that can display the metadata XML file in a nicer way?
The question is there a way to see the metadata file in a nicer way? So I think you can use also a JSON representation, which is better. You can use it via an URI request, URI parameter, and you can also use it via the gateway client to see it in a better way. But you could also, for example, see it now, where we will go now, because we don't want to read XML or JSON. We want to create an application, and there we can also see the entity sets in a little bit more graphical way. So I can now go to the web IDE, which is here for me deployed locally. You see this in the URL, localhost. And here in this web IDE deployed locally, I can now start a wizard, which is project from template. And I can select the list report application. And here, somewhere, you see this is a Fiori Elements application, this pattern. You could also use others. But this one is which we support end-to-end, and the default also for us internally. And I can now, for example, say, yes, I want to have a sales order items analysis. So, and by defining this name, after defining this name, I can now select the backend system which I want to have, which is normally then the gateway frontend server, or in my case in the cloud we have the embedded approach, gateway embedded, and then I select my single system, and I can now select the service which is required, and the service name, you'd never see it here, but you see it. Do you see it here? Generated artifacts, OData published true. No, you don't see it because the mapping is quite trivial, because it's the name of the CDS view underscore CDS. If I copy now the name of the CDS view, which is exposed by OData published true, then I get nearly the same name, just added with the suffix underscore CDS. Coming back to your question, at least here, I should see, yes, then the entity sets, and in the entity sets also then the different things. Okay, so I select this, entity set, this collection, and now we have here a page where we can now select the annotation files. So like I said, this UI semantic is reflected via this metadata extensions and is exposed to OData via an annotation file. In this annotation file, it's a different resource. I can select here and to proceed, because if I would not select it, then the smart template cannot be smart because it does not have information. So we want to provide the backend defined UI semantic. Then I can select the OData collection which I want to display, and that's it. So I just say which OData service, what's basically the name of the app, I select which collection, and then I'm done. Then I have a little bit of, welcome. We have a little bit of code generation here, but this code is basically generic, so it calls internally some reuse APIs from the Fiori elements components. So and I can quickly start it. I don't need a mock server because I have a running OData service. We don't need to mock it. And then we can see in the Fiori Launchpad our applied application. So as I said, everything is locally done here. And then we can see that we have a very small but working, hopefully working Fiori applications. So we can see here the smart filter bar, where we have this text search, and we can also see here this table, this ALV-like table, where we have the different columns, like the company name, which we depicted, the sales order ID, and the item position. And I can now press go, and we get the data back immediately for the different companies, sales order, and item position. So, and I can also say adapt filters here. For example, I could add more filters on all available columns. If I would like to have this per default, I would have to add some UI semantic in the backend, but also the end user can freely choose what to use here. It's just the default which I define in the backend. And then in the settings, for example, very similar to the ALV, I can select the relevant columns to be displayed, the sort rules, the filter rules, and maybe also grouping. But since this backend OData service does not support analytical scenarios, I can just say I want to group by a single field, and the grouping is done on client side. I will show you it's probably not the way you want to have it, so I just have the different companies where we group by, and that's it. So that's not what we actually want to have. So we want to have real aggregation and real grouping. Therefore, let's first go to the backend and try to understand why this is working like we have shown, like I have shown. So we have the CDS view, and we have this annotation file, this metadata extension. And here in this annotation file, we define, for example, on which layer we are working. So like core, customer, industry, localization, and partner. And we define the different annotations. For the CDS view, I just created or extended for the sales order item 01. And here I could, for example, define the search relevant fields. So that means the fields which should be used when a text search is executed. And I can also define now the positions of the different columns. So position is then used by the UI to bring them into an order. And obviously you don't want to do that as a backend developer, but you want to have a WYSIWYG tool. What you see is what you get tool for that. This is the metadata extension file, the MDE file of CDS, yes, exactly. So, but now we want to introduce real aggregation and grouping. So I have, of course, prepared something here. So we have the amount, and we have the transaction currency, and we provide here semantics, similar as we did it in the past in the DEDIC. We provide here semantics to these fields, like what is my currency code, and is it a currency code, and I could also add here a default aggregation like sum for amount. When I activate this one, then we have this new field amount. Of course, this should also be displayed on the UI per default. I don't want to select it all the time from the settings dialog. And now I refresh my UI. And if I go and I see now the total gross amount for the different items. And the nice thing now is I can really go to this grouping tab, and I can define now my grouping rules. So first, group by the company name. Second, group by the sales order ID. And now I see that the different companies are aggregated here and the different sales orders, and I can see then the items. So that works. But what does not work is that I can see on each level, on each grouping line, the currency or the amount, because we have different currencies given here. So actually what we want to see is one amount in a given currency and basically in the company name, a company related currency. Therefore, we can go back to the back end and use a nice integration of the HANA currency conversion into CDS. So we have a built-in function in CDS, which is the currency conversion. And we have again a field amount, which is the result of this currency conversion built-in function. And we can convert the given amount in the given transaction currency and convert it into the target currency, sales order customer currency. And then we can define which date for the exchange rate should be used, could also be parameterized, and then we offer this value, which is then converted as the amount in the given customer currency. Now I activate this again. I go to the UI and press F5 to refresh the UI. And unfortunately, now again, my grouping and aggregation was gone. So I could persist this as my end-user default setting, which is offered by UI5 via a backend service. But I want to offer this basically for all end users as a default. Therefore, I forgot to add this UI representation variant. Again, a UI annotation which says the grouping per default should be first by company name and then by sales order. I activate this again, so this is basically the default setting. I press F5. And now we can see that we have this grouping available, first by company name, then by the sales order, and we can see that the values are provided in the related company name currencies. So, what can we do next? Maybe now I want to filter on the country. So we see here, for example, I can search for SAP, and then I just see SAP, and the grouping is also only performed on these values related to this company. But I maybe don't want to have it via the text search. I want to have it as a normal filter value. So therefore, I could also add here a selection field. First in the CDS view, I add the country, which is reached via the sales order customer. I basically want to filter on the country here for the customer. And the values which are shown in the value help of this field are basically all values which can be reached by following the association to the customer country. Therefore, I take this field in here and I define the association underscore currency from sales order to customer to country, The country association I define as a foreign key association, and by defining that, we automatically take this as a value help information, and then a value help can be provided generically here without any implementation. Activate that again. Of course, the field should also be shown on the UI as a selection field. That means in the selection screen, which we call Smart Filter Bar, and that's it. Both is active. I go back, press F5. Now I would expect in this, in the Smart Filter Bar here the country. We can click on the value help. We have then as input parameters of the value help all columns of the target of this association, and we get here all the values. So I can also filter on them, and then these are taken into account. Yes, please.
How would you have to modify the script to get all the amounts displayed in the same currency?
The question is, how can I modify the script that everything is shown in the same currency? So that means independent of the country of the customer. So then I could define, for example, here in this CDS view, we take now as a target currency the individual currency of the customer. Of course, I could also say that the currency should for all be the same. So, for example, for all be euro, and maybe I even want to parameterize that by the client, that the client can decide which is used. So then you can use CDS parameters and use a parameter here as the value, and then even the client could specify in which currency everything should be converted. It's okay?
In the currency conversion in the ECC world, there's only a currency type.
And the currency type is?
Which is one of the parameters when we have a currency conversion, because we have different exchange rate types. Is that not part of this?
You mean, for example, the type euro or the type US dollar?
No, we have like N, which is the monthly exchange rate, or the bunch typically in ECC have different exchange rate types.
So I have to admit, probably it's also a parameter here, but I'm not so deep. Yes, probably exactly. Yeah. But I don't really know. So, but if you want to have a better answer, just drop me a mail. I will forward it. So, other questions? Okie doke. So then we are through. We have now added these fields. The orientations are running well. So let's go back to the next topic. So the next topic is the support for transactional applications. Because read-only is quite simple in a stateless or RESTful programming model or architecture, because reading data can be done very easily without having a state at all. But now what about transactional applications? And actually, what is state about? What is it exactly? And how do we handle that? And the answer here is with a draft concept. So if we now have if we go back to what we already know, which is a classic world of how to create an application. So for example, with SAP GUI, with WebInfo ABAP or BSP, then we always have one user working with one client connected to one ABAP session, backend session, connected to the database. So all these three things, the client, the user, and the session are connected to each other. And of course, the business logic is implemented in ABAP, and the state is where we have the business logic. So that means, for example, the transactional buffer. We all know that. We have them in function modules or in some classes, in some frameworks supporting us with business objects. We have the state in internal tables. And now, if we reach, for example, after 1 or more hours, a point where we were inactive as an end user, then a timeout happens, because if I go 2 weeks on vacation, it's not acceptable that for 2 weeks all the resources I was working on and I did not finalize the work, that these resources are blocked, because they are locked. So, but they should be free to proceed, and therefore we have a timeout, which kills all the locks and the state which is in the session. So we have one good point here. One good point regarding our qualities is the early feedback. So because the client sends all the deltas, all the changes which were done by the user to the backend business logic is applied, and then we get, for example, error message immediately. But since we have this tightly coupling of the end user, the client, and the backend session, we cannot do any device switch, for example, and we do not have this continuous work due to the timeout. And of course, collaboration is not possible at all. We cannot change the user for this running ABAP session. We also don't want to do that. So next step is first simple idea which we could apply to a Fiori application, to a transactional Fiori application, would be to have some kind of batch input-like application, which means that we do have the state while the data entry happens on the client side. Of course, for us, business logic is always in ABAP, just small exceptions, but the state is then held on the client, and just if I press the save button, then the state is transferred to the back end. which is very similar to what some people do, because the ABAP old classic SAP GUI transaction have always these freeze of the UI once you provide an invalid value and then you are blocked by going ahead with your work. Then sometimes people tend to enter the data in Excel sheets until they have the data and then use batch input to get the data into the system and iterate until all values are correct. So, which is basically the same approach here. We collect all the data in this Fiori app on the client side, and when I press save, I try to bring it to the backend, which is successful or not. But by doing that, we are even worse than the classic world, because we do not support collaboration, because the data is locally on my device. No device switch, because the data is locally on my device. We don't have continuous work, because the data is locally on my device. And we don't have even the early feedback, because the business logic is not applied during the data entry, just if I press save. So it's basically not a good idea. It's an idea which we could apply to very simple applications where we don't have real transactional support, where we don't have exclusive logs. So for example, for some configuration UIs or something like that. It would be a very simple pattern which might fulfill such simple scenarios. But for real transaction applications, it's not reasonable. So there we need a better approach, which is our draft approach. So in this case, we might have several persons working with any kind of device on our application backend, which does, from a conceptual point of view, not have any session, at least not between two calls to the backend. And we of course have HANA. I know the idea is quite simple. We have the business logic, like always, in ABAP, but the state, whatever that means, is persisted on the database. And since it is not part of the session anymore, we can of course kill the session, for example, in order to apply an upgrade or to apply fixes. But the client doesn't know, or the database doesn't know about the different clients. So by each client, I can now change to further changes which are applied to this persisted state, which is also probably possible for different personas, for different persons, of course, considering security aspects. And with this approach, we get the feedback. If we provide the data regularly to the database and apply the business logic there, we have the continuous work, because I don't care about the ABAP session anymore. The data is persisted on the database level, and it's also persisted there in 1 hour, or in 2 hours, or in 5 hours. And I can do the device switch, because the database, the persisted state, doesn't care about it. So, but what does it now really mean? So what is actually the state? Discussing what the state is can take a lot of time. So we discussed it. You might have a different discussion result, but for us the state is structured like that. We have the technical state, which is basically the authentication, the connection to the database, to other systems as well. So we are not interested in that here. We are basically interested in the semantic state, which is essential. Essential means we cannot get rid of it, or if it is destroyed, then the app is corrupt, then the data is inconsistent. And this essential state consists of 3 things. So first of all the data modifications the end user did, so everything he entered, for example. Then secondly, the interaction data. So for example, did I show already an error message, yes or no, or what about redo undo mechanisms? And the third point, very important for us, are the logs. Because if we have conceptually no ABAP session, what happens to the logs? Because normally the logs are connected or part of the ABAP session. And then we have the inessential state. These are data which are persisted or stored locally for performance reasons. For example, if I want to validate data, I don't want to read the data I validate against again and again. I will just store it in some internal tables, global variables, or whatever. So now our thing we need to consider is basically this one here. What are we doing with the essential state, especially with the logs? So if we have now a look on this simple scenario, this batch input, what would it mean regarding that one? So if I say we have a perceived transaction, the transaction is not reflected technically, it's reflected from the perceived world from the end user. So the time when he presses the edit button until he presses discard or save. This is a perceived transaction from the end user. And like I said, the data is captured at the client side, and only when he presses save, the data is processed in the back end, and then we get feedback. Was it accepted or not? So not acceptable if I enter 2 hours data and then I get the feedback that the first value which I entered was already wrong, which might influence all the other fields that are available there. Not a good idea. In the draft application, where we have all these qualities achieved, we have now the answer to that, because the perceived transaction, within the perceived transaction, we have multiple, we call it transaction steps, where the client decides that the data which was entered so far is written to the backend, and the backend also executes these changes by applying the business logic, getting the feedback, providing the feedback to the UI, to the end user, and persisting the data as a draft. So even if I create new data or if I change data, then always these changes are saved as draft, independent if they are consistent or inconsistent. They are always saved. And the client can then decide, and can of course also be influenced, when these transaction steps should happen. But at the end, when the save button is triggered, the end user was always informed what of the things he entered was correct and what not, what was consistent, what not. And then if everything is okay, he can press save, and then the actual draft, which is persisted, is then transferred into the normal active data. So the draft is for us basically something similar to the transaction buffer, which all of you know from your applications and your function modules. So where you persist all the changes that are done in the current transaction, where you persist these in some transactional buffer internal table. We have the same here, but we just put it into the database table to achieve these qualities. So the transactional buffer is now on the database, and this is the draft, in simple words. So and we persisted in a different database table, not in the same, but in a shadow table, because it might harm the complete system if you would persist it in the same database table, because there are thousands of reports, analytical reports and everything running on the original database persistence, and if you would now introduce a new flag is active or is draft, and only one application would not consider this flag, then it would be not good. So because then the transactional changes done by some users would be reflected in some analytical use cases, which is obviously not wanted, because it's just the transactional state of the current end user there. Therefore, and for other reasons, for performance reasons as well, we have now 2 persistencies. One is the draft and one is the active. The draft persistence is written here, and at the end the instances from the drafts are transferred into the active if everything is consistent and is saved. So this is basically the idea. And based on that we can then achieve all the qualities which we discussed here. Yes, please?
Is the draft object specifically saved for the current user? Or can another user go on with the draft object?
So the question, if I got it right, is when I work now and the draft is created, is someone else also able to modify this draft?
Yeah.
So the answer is that currently we support only the exclusive draft, which means I can only exclusively work on the draft, but there are also ideas that we might offer a shared draft, which can be worked on with different users or with the collaboration I just mentioned. But currently we support just the exclusive draft. Yes, please?
But let's say 2 users work on the same object, so will the second user get an notification or something?
So
this object is locked?
So question is about locking. How does locking work with regards to draft? Comes to the next slide, thank you. It's explained there. Yes, please?
Is it available only for S4HANA or also for business people?
It's only available for S4HANA. Other questions? So, now coming back to the questions about logs. In this batch input application, it's quite simple. We don't have exclusive logs because we have no interaction with the backend system. But we can apply, of course, optimistic logging, which is called an OData ETAG. So OData with ETAG supports that while you are reading data, you get back, for example, a timestamp or a hash key or whatever, which reflects the current state of the data, current status of the data. And when you do the changes, you provide as a client this value again, and then the backend can check if changes were applied in the meanwhile or not. Yeah? So typical optimistic logs. So, and of course, this works only, as I said, for simple applications. We don't have exclusive logs here. We provide this ETAG at the end, and then the backend first does not compare the ETAG value, but first tries to log exclusively during this processing here the changed document, and if the logging, exclusive logging, was successful, then a comparison of the ETAG is performed, and if the ETAG comparison was successful, then the changes can be applied if they are consistent. So it has exactly to happen in this order, not the other way around, because if you compare first the ETAG and do then the logs, it might you have a race condition if something happens in parallel, in a different session. So that's very easy. Now for the draft, it's a bit more complex, but I will also briefly explain why it is a little bit more complex. We have certain reasons for that. So again, we have here the perceived transaction in the draft application. And now, during this draft changing, we have then this delta handling here with the backend where we apply the changes, like we saw on the previous slide. And then, of course, we also create a log, an exclusive log, once I press the edit button. And the log is available until we have a certain period of time of inactivity of the end user, where then a timeout is applied for the logs. And then we don't have these exclusive logs. That means if I'm changing something, everything is fine, I'm 50 minutes, the default, which can also be configured, 50 minutes inactive, then I lose my exclusive logs, similar like the ABAP session after 1 hour. I lose after 50 minutes logs, and if I want to proceed, I can do that as long as nobody else changed it in the meanwhile. So also like always, so we are protected via optimistic logs. And if I resume these logs now, which the end user probably even does not see, if we resume these logs now, then we are protected again. If somebody else changed it in the meanwhile, my changes are not accepted anymore, so they are declined. So, and now the difference here between this approach and the normal classic approach is that we separate the data, the state, the data, from the logs. The logs need a timeout, because without a timeout, I will block all the other users. But the data which is persisted is still available. So in creation scenarios, for example, the log is not relevant because I only see the instance and the data will be available as long as our garbage collector, after half a year, does not run, it's available in the system. Yes, please.
Is timeout, is that the system parameter or is it time?
The timeout?
The timeout, the length of the timeout.
The length of the timeout is a configuration. It's possible to configure this per business object. Yes, please.
Can you see those logs still in S4H140?
Now the question comes up, what about logs that are not part of the ABAP session? What are these logs? And these logs are, again, enqueue server logs, which you see in the SM12, but they have just a different coloring or maybe a different entries in the columns, and they are durable logs. So we invented in the ABAP client, in the ABAP server technology, that we have also logs that are not connected to an ABAP session, but which are, the context is not the ABAP session, but the context is the draft, the leading draft document. And once the draft is deleted, the log is deleted. Once we have this timeout, the log is deleted. And we have a persistence which holds this together, so which holds the data and the logs together. But this is the key point here. The key message, We separate, we split the logs from the data. Logs still have the timeout, but independent of the ABAP session, data is persisted on the database. Other questions? Okay, so what does it now mean for us in this picture? I just, because the delta is quite small, we can see now here that we, besides all the other aspects and artifacts which we had, that we do now have the concept of business object supported here, because the business object is for us always the key concept for transactional scenarios with or without draft, independent of that. So, and the business object, I think 30% of you raised the hand that you know it, but for me a business object is something that has a structure. So BO structure is one single node, which is the root node, which has a composition tree to other nodes. An example, for example, the business partner having the address, has maybe one main address and several other aspects. Or the sales order with the items, and beneath the items we have the schedule line, for example. So we have a composition tree below this composition root, which is then the BO structure. So, but besides data, we also have behavior. So business object has behavior. Business object supports generically, similar to OData, a little bit different, supports create, update, delete, default operations. I can always create, update, or delete a sales order if it is enabled. And business object might have specific operations like decline or like accept, which are specific to the business object. They might have parameters, a different output, different input. And then the third point is we have a runtime for this business object, which is currently for us here BOPF. So what's now the tasks of this different things? So on the right hand side you see the things which are generically provided or supported by the business object runtime, by the BOPF runtime. So we have an application which is not only working with get, but now also with put and post. And the put and post, that means the data changes, are then handled by this framework. And the right-hand side is done generically by the framework, and the left-hand side are the exits, the hook methods, basically, to be implemented by the application developer. So because we are very sure that all application logic, all business logic, can be split into three different types, which are actions, decline, accept, something that can be executed by a button on a user interface, for example, or a validation, so a side effect which is triggered when I create, update, delete data, which need to be configured. Is the entered business partner ID valid for the given sales order, or does the business partner not exist at all? And the third point is determination. Determinations are calculations which are done by reading the data, which is PBO, or after modifying the data, which is PAI, basically. So is it written to the database after I change something, or is it just calculated when I read something? So, and these three patterns, these three implementation types are then the things, the core things which are implemented by developers, application developers. So, coming to the demo. I will not show how to create a complete new draft application. This was done by the hands-on session, and I have shown it last year, also here on the TechEd. But now I have prepared an application. We can see it here. It's called Manage Sales Orders. So the last application was read-only. This one here is now with transactional support. So we can see here, for example, similar design, but we see a little bit more that we have not only the list with operations defined on it for the given sales orders, but we have also here like actions, set to delivered. We have the delete button if I select something. We have the create button, or I could also change data. If I go to the object page, I have also the option here to edit data. So this is not a draft application, this is this batch input application. I do all the changes on the client side, and then I press save and something happens. If I click now edit, nothing happens in the back end, and I can change data here, so quantity -1, and I can jump into a different field, nothing happens. I can press save, and now the $batch, OData $batch, with this change, -1, is applied to the backend. The backend business logic is triggered, and only now, after pressing the save button, I get the feedback. -1 is not allowed, obviously. Okay, -1 is not allowed. I want to go back. Then I get the message, well, if you are now leaving the page, then all your changes are discarded. So if I'm now working since 2 hours, and I really have to finish my work because I have to go somewhere else and I don't want to get a timeout, so here you don't get a timeout, but I even cannot do it, I have to shut down my PC, then I'm lost. I have no chance to get to store this data. It's gone. So now we want to make an application, a draft application out of that. So first of all, let's see which kinds of artifacts are involved here.
Excuse me, one question. But this scenario is still possible with any DB currently. This not so beautiful with writing this data on a database.
So the question is this still possible on any DB?
Like using CDS with change delete on any DB?
Yes.
This is possible.
This is possible,
yeah.
yes. It's possible
in the way that you just showed.
It's possible in the way I've shown on any DB, but I think with 750 we don't have a very good support, and with 751 SP2 it gets better and better, also with this draft support, so maybe this one can also be used on other stacks, but the new NetWeaver releases are not, as far as I know, not consumed independent of S4HANA. So these features I show here, based on 752, are just available in S4HANA context. So let's wait how it is. So, and now we see the different artifacts. We see basically 4 of them. So we have sales order and we have items. And we have the sales order, which is basically the business object. And we have the sales order item, which is a subnode. So let's start with this I_sales order. So in the session just before I started here, Horst Schnörer from S4HANA team has explained all the VDM details about conventions and all that stuff. So in the VDM world, the virtual data model world in S4HANA, there are naming conventions for CDS. So for example, I_ means interface views. So interface views in S4HANA and the virtual data model are basically the lowest layer of the normalized, semantically normalized data model. Yeah, the sales order. And here the sales order has also transactional support, therefore we have the naming convention TP, like transactional processing. Then the sales order has of course an association which is called item, which follows to the second CDS view. I navigate from here via F3 to the sales order item, which selects data from the sales order item and adds the transactional processing. In a clear new world, or when you are starting building applications from the scratch in the future, you probably will not define a view, because a view is normally used to denormalize something. And I just said it's semantically normalized, which is somehow contradicts, but this is because we want to harmonize the data model from the suite via the virtual data model. From a greenfield approach, we would use here in the future a CDS entity, which defines a table. In this table, we would have the transaction processing enablement. But here we have a CDS view now, which has create enabled, delete enabled, update enabled, and some kind of active persistency. So, but now what about the other 2 views? Why do we need 4 CDS views? Like I said, the interface views are the business object. And we had at the beginning, I mentioned that we have to support this redundancy coming from this role-based approach, because we want to, for example, create maybe one app which simply shows the sales orders without create, without update, without delete, but just with an accept button. So the, I don't know, manager app. I just want to accept sales orders, that's it. See them and accept them. And then I somehow have to project all the data and all the capabilities, the operations which are supported by the PO. So I have to decline, create, update, and delete, and just offer one of the, I don't know, 50 actions, which is called accept. And therefore, we have this concept of consumption views. The consumption views are now a projection of the data and of the functionality of the operations. Therefore, here in this C view, C underscore sales order TP, which selects from the I interface view, I can now define which behavior should be supported here. I could also decide for disabling create, update or delete, or just disabling the delete button, for example, depending on the app which I create. I could also decide to not expose the item, but only the sales order in my OData service. So these consumption views are now app and therefore OData service specific. The I views are owned by the backend and they are just there one time. And this is then the reuse object. So now let's introduce the draft. The draft is simply an annotation, draft enable true, and I had told you we need a persistence, a shadow persistence, which is defined, not defined here, but named here. And if I now search for this artifact, then we can see that it does not exist. So the draft shadow table in this scenario here is created by us automatically. And on item level, I don't need to mention draft again, because draft is a capability of the complete business object, but I have to define a new persistency for this, a new database table, or to provide a name. And now I can activate the complete business object. And once I activate this business object, we from the programming model take now care that this database table for the shadow is created automatically, because we know which fields to add there, because it's a little bit more complex, because the draft cannot reuse the primary key of the active data, because it might not be entered so far, or you have late numbering doesn't work, so how to link all the instances. Therefore we are adding here some GUIDs, draft GUIDs to this persistence. But we take care for the draft persistence that is consistent, that includes, for example, also key user extension fields, which are added to the active persistence, also the draft persistence. And now I have it in my business object. Yeah? I don't have to know all these details, I just say draft enabled, which is my draft persistence, that's it. And in the sales order consumption view, I do now have to enable it as well, because draft is also, simply spoken, a capability, and I have to decide actively if it should also be exposed to my OData service, because it also runs without that. So now I have enabled my backend just by using these three things. For the simple scenario, of course, I'm always showing just simple scenarios. In the reality, it's much more complex. Anyways, I press F5, and now I would expect that it's automatically rendered in a different way. So for example, we can see another field here, which is the editing status. The editing status is part of the draft concept, and it's basically a partitioning of the different data records. So I could, for example, filter on my own drafts. So if I'm working on 5 documents in parallel, then I have the option to see these 5 documents that I'm working on in my working list here by selecting this filter. I could also see which documents are locked by another user. I could also see which documents are not locked because they are in the optimistic phase, which are unsaved changes by another user. Maybe I want to decide if I can override it or not. And I can see the unchanged data, which is active data where nobody is currently working on. So own drafts, we don't have one of them because I'm not changing something. But having now all again, I maybe want to do the same as we did before. I go into this instance, Delbond Industry. I go into edit mode. And I copy this URL and open a second one. Voila. So, and I copy this URL, of course. So now we can see, I just went back, we can already see that we have a draft here. So I haven't done nothing but press the edit button, which means I'm in edit mode with this document. And we have now already created a draft including the pessimistic, the exclusive log. And we can see here administrative data when I changed it for the last time. Yeah? So if now somebody else would change that one, I would even see which user changed it and how long, and see how long it will be locked in addition. So, but here, if I go now into this detail, I'm in edit mode, and I press here -1, enter here -1, nothing happens, because we do not want for every keystroke to have a communication to the database, obviously, because it would, I don't know, be much trouble. So, but if I change now to a different field, to a different section, then this draft is saved, and we get the error message here directly located where the error occurred. And if I click on it, we can see the error message, only positive quantity are allowed. So the data is of course still not in the active persistence, but is now persisted in the draft shadow table created by us, the persisted transactional buffer, and I get the error message back. And now independent what I do here on the left-hand side, if I click now on the right, in the other app, which might be a different device, a different browser, not a different user so far, I can also see that this value is here available. Okay.
What happens if you change it now?
Yeah, good question. What happens if I change it here now? So we are working on it that you have also e-tech protection, but that a user is trying to I don't know, to destroy himself. I don't know. He can do that. So, but e-tech handling will then in future protect that you can do changes here once you are working in this one.
Actually, I was thinking more along the lines of tools like Google Docs or Etherpad, where you can collaboratively edit one document. So whenever something is changed in one version of the browser, then everyone else gets the update.
So that you get notifications on the different...
like I enter a new number on the right side.
And you get an update on the left side. Yes. So notifications are also a topic, but that's the way how we are happy to support it now. More is currently not supported. Yes, please.
When you went into edit mode on that screen, then why isn't it not locked on that screen?
Why isn't it?
Then there's you create log and you press the edit button.
Yes.
So you can edit or save folder in that screen, but you can also edit it in another screen. So why doesn't it say the border is locked?
So the question is here, if this only applies for the same user, if the same user opens the same instance in two different screens, why isn't it locked in the second screen? And this is where we have to introduce e-tech handling, that the same instance cannot be changed also in a different application. Yes, so this is something which is open, but which only might be a problem for a single user. So a cross user, I would not be able to edit it. It's just if it is me and I open the same twice, then it is not checked. Yes. So another question which always comes up: why don't I see the error message here? So just because I did not change the data, the answer is that error messages, in this case here, can be persisted for drafts, but that the current logic in the back end is not persisting the error messages. So you have a flavor in your BOPF validations to say, is the error message transition or is it a state error message? And since we started with this batch input thing, which does not persist error messages, of course, because there is no state, the current constant which is used is transition, but we can also choose here persisted or state message, and then we will also see it on the right hand side if we just read the data without modifying it. Okay, so and now we can see that this also works if I'm leaving my screen, but you also recognize it by when you open something else. I could close the browser, I could shut down my computer. Of course it's persisted in some database, and if I open it for the next time, the values are still there. And I'm not blocked by my work. I can enter whatever I want, as long as it fits to the domain of the given field. It has to fit, of course, into the data type of the given field. So, if there are no further questions, then we can go back to our slides. Yes, please.
Do you have any naming conventions or maybe framework for the CDS?
So question is, what about the naming convention of the CDS views? The naming convention is invented or created by S4HANA, by the VDM team, and I'm not 100% sure what the current status is, if these naming conventions are offered also as documentation. So I'm not 100% sure. Okay, so now the question comes up. I'm now, I don't know, implementing on an older release, maybe not S4HANA, what can I use where? So the left-hand side I will not explain in detail. It's only a list of hints which you could use in order to decide which technology you want to use, because you might then be prepared for the future, and this is some kind of best practice here, what from my point of view is reasonable to be used. So we started basically by building this programming model on 740, where we invented CDS, and later on, for example, where we also had now BOPF, which was first in the Business Suite Foundation layer, which is now also part of the SAP Basis. Things you should not do, as a recommendation of course, is like implementing OData services for read-only scenarios, so the read-only part by your own. So implementing getEntity and getEntitySet for something that is persisted in the database does not make too much sense. It just takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of nerves because you will have many issues. So I know it because I implemented it also first time for our framework. And this is done generically by our framework, like you saw. There's not a single line of code for filtering, for sorting, for text search. Just some hints, some annotations in CDS, and the rest is done automatically. So it's highly recommended to use this. And of course, this is nothing new. So every new computer scientist in the school learns it, and the university, that we have a clear separation of concerns. So we should try in the future not to mix the actual business coding to mix this with technical aspects. So for example, to write business logic into some gateway-specific protocol classes like DBCX or NBCX, but to write the coding in a way that can be reused in other contexts as well, the best way without using a state internally. So that it's just something I can call, which gives me feedback, and I can then use it wherever I want. And of course, it should also not consider too many technical aspects, so that we can integrate that coding then also later on in other scenarios. The benefits which you have if you apply the recommendations here are that you are prepared for what comes next with S4HANA, even if you are not now on S4HANA. But if you learn how to use, for example, CDS and DCL, then you are prepared by using it also for S4HANA, and even your investments are safe because they can be completely reused in S4HANA or by applying S4HANA. And of course, if you use frameworks like BOPF right now and you get familiar with the concepts, you are also prepared there for the future, or your teams and the skills. So now coming to some cross topics. What does it mean to OData before? So what we learned is that the way how our own developers, for example, in S4HANA, so we had very close contact to the SM development of OData services, is that they really like this approach. So SFIN went out with HANA Live based on HANA artifacts and with manual OData implementations, and they more or less completely switched to our approach of using CDS and our approach of using this OData exposure and UI annotations for smart templates and smart controls. So that means we have here a growing adoption, and because we have a growing adoption, and we will in future support OData before, we decided that we will not support this manual approach in a convenient way anymore. It is supported, but not in a convenient way, so we will not offer a gateway service builder in the future for OData before. So nothing will be removed, of course, but we don't want to extend it for OData before, but we will go ahead with this approach of this integrated programming model. And if you want to have some fancy features which we do not offer, which is probably reasonable, then you can always do this MPC and TPC implementation by your own, by using S-Pro or IMG, where you can then select for the model and for the service the corresponding classes, but there is no gateway service builder code generation in the future for OData before. So, and the reason is also for us, at least for me, it's reasonable, this approach, because we see that, which is also very natural, that if you invest in these reuse artifacts like CDS or like this business object, then it's really independent. Your investment is independent of where it is used. And this connection to the different protocols can be done also by technical guys like us from the frameworks to integrate this, for example, in OData v2, in future in OData v4, or whatever comes. And therefore it's reasonable to use these best practices, to use the programming model where it is protocol independent, and therefore you have then minimal effort in the future to come into a new world, into a new protocol, into a new UI technology offered by us or maybe also by someone else. Then testability. There was also a detailed session from Thomas Alexander Ritter going to detail for this topic. So testability has to be applied on multiple layers, on different units or different more coarse granular things, for example the OData service or the CDS views. How can I do it there? A very important point is that the OData service is of course triggered via OData, that means via HTTP, which means the actual session where it is executed is a different one than the session where the test is executed. So therefore it's a different ABAP session. Testing something else, so for example the concrete service implementation, the gateway service implementation, independent on how it is implemented, generically or not, can be done in the same session. This is very important, we will see it in a minute. Now we can say, okay, we have different test types, so for example the smoke tests or integration tests, where I want to use it via OData. I just want to see that everything works from the top to the end. I want to maybe call $metadata just to see if the OData service is alive and is running, and therefore I can use SECAD OData, which is a technology to generate OData clients for testing purposes and IUnit classes to test an OData service. On deeper level, we have of course ABAP unit, which we use for unit tests, but also for other automated tests. We could apply, of course, ABAP unit for classes, and we could also test CDS views here. But which is currently missing, and this is for me a big gap, is that we are not able to test the service implementation on backend side in an efficient way. This is something which is currently under construction. Why? This is now the story about the backend session, because we have invested a lot in the last two releases, 751, 752, and also currently we're still investing, to have testable frameworks in the game. So this is very important. Testable frameworks, so just to understand why we need them, if I do now want to test an OData service and I would have an API to test my service locally in the same ABAP session, and I have now my OpenSQL testable framework, then I'm able to provide test data for the different database tables that are involved, and every OpenSQL statement executed based on these tables would then consider the test data which I provide without writing the test data in the actual table. That means OpenSQL has a mechanism to duplicate under the hood the original table via, again, also a shadow table where this for me specific data and for me specific table is persisted, and all OpenSQL statements based on these tables are then covering or using this test data. So we can here isolate the execution of the business logic from the concrete test data in the original database business. So now imagine you are working in a bigger landscape, you have your consolidation system. In the consolidation system you have, I don't know, like millions of data records, and you have different users with different authorizations. You always need to configure how does the test data look like, or you apply test data containers. You configure which users should have which access authorizations, and then you can expect the result. And with this approach here, with OpenSQL Testable Framework, you can isolate the testing from the test data by providing the test data in your test without changing it on the DB, and by providing also authorization values for the current user. So you can stop also the authorization values of the current user executing the tests without having all the different users with a predefined set of authorizations in the system. It's just part of your unit test. And this is a major benefit where a lot of guys, and at least now at SAP, are very happy because it significantly simplifies the testing, the way how you can test the application. So other testable frameworks are also in place. So for example for CDS, also for ABAP testable frameworks where you can say I want to inject a different implementation. So for example I have an ABAP class wrapping a function module. The function module is not owned by me, I just want to call it, but I don't want my test to be read. If this function module does something wrong, then I can also implement a test double for this interface, which might simply return a value which I expect from it, and then the test double, the function module is not called. So here we have major progress to isolate the test from the dependent on controls, component dependent components. So now about authorizations. It's not my favorite topic, but nevertheless it's also part of the programming model. So here we also distinguish between this data model, basically the I-views which I mentioned, and the OData service, which also includes this C consumption views which I mentioned from a conceptual point of view. So now we have different artifacts in the system. We have the PFCG object, we have the user, we have the role, and we have OAuth. Who of you knows the PFCG authorization object? Okay, very good. So with the PFCG object, the authorization object, I can define a schema which is used to add user-specifically values which are used at runtime to decide if an instance, a document can be shown or not to a user, if it can be updated or created. So these PFCG objects are at design time created by the application developer, and they can be used, for example, in transactional coding via the classic authority check. So nothing new about that, the authority check in ABAP. But now, via the DCL, I could also use them for the query. That means in typical scenarios, ALV gets an internal table. How is the internal table created? I just read the data via the selection screen from the database, select, and then I do a check authorization in between. But now, with the DCL, we push this down to the database. That means I have CDS, define this DCL artifact related to the PFCG object, and then OpenSQL at runtime reads out the user-specific authorization values and restricts the result set on the database by extending the where clause already. So that means I only get the data into my application server I am then authorized for, and I don't have this iteration when I get nothing which is authorized to read it again. So this I do on data model level, and then I need to prepare something for the administrator, whoever that is, to declare which PFCG objects are relevant for an OData service by creating a role template. And I'm not only interested in the instance-based authorizations, but also in the start authorization. So I have to add the PFCG object as service from gateway with the name of the OData service, so that a user later on related to a role is able to execute the service. So first start authorization, then instance authorizations. So OAuth, we come to that later. Administrator, he can now create such a role based on this role template and some more tooling, and can then assign these roles to the user. So am I now the manager, just having this one role-based application with this accept button and only display mode, or am I now an expert user and having other services which I want to be able to call? And then for each user having these roles, I can then define as an administrator the different user-specific authorization values. So for which cost centers am I actually allowed to see the sales orders? And then, of course, the ABAP runtime checks the as-service, the start authorization by gateway, and the OpenSQL, like I said, considers automatically the PFCG authorization values provided by the administrator in the corresponding OpenSQL calls of CDS artifacts with the DCL artifact. And in transactional scenarios, you know that probably much better than me, where the authority check, the PFCG values are like always considered, so no changes here, but just we provided here to have a complete picture on this topic. OAuth is now a topic for example, for AX scenarios, where I want to allow that connection to my web service, for example, an S4HANA system, is available where the consumer is not the end user, but a different, for example, microservice or service calling this one. So a third-party call, I can define if this is also allowed or not. So no questions, also not your favorite topic, maybe. Now the future. Yes, please.
So, earlier you showed the stuff, and one of the most simplest questions is who's allowed to read and who's allowed to write. And I saw the authorization model where you just said not required. You showed those the authorizations. So how could you achieve that, basically giving all the states in a simple way without creating two different data services that I can distinguish between read and write? Simple question.
Distinguish, you want
Between read and write, I want to have one.
You want to have one application, you can just read and I can read and write.
Yeah.
So you can just read and I can read and write. Therefore, we offer, first of all, you don't want to show it on the UI, that you can write, that you can create or update data. Therefore, we have this concept of feature control, where you can say that this instance does not support create or update for the current user. So then, if this is not shown on the UI, I would also use it via OData and try to update and to create the data. And then, in the normal transactional processing, here in BOPF, there are breakouts where you implement this authority check. And this authority check proves then that you are not allowed to do it. And then you get an error message, you are not allowed to do it. So first thing is, where we want to be better than the past, that we do not show things you are not allowed to do. This is our topic, feature control in general, and the next step is, of course, we cannot rely on it, because everyone can decide to do it in a different way. We also need to validate this in the back end, so here we're coming to validations and to authority checks.
That on slide 32, I think you said that you don't want to have authorization checks in the business logic.
On slide 32, I said as do and don't.
Yeah, that one.
Business logic mixed with technical aspects. Yes, exactly. You're right, very good. Without writing it down. But it's 31, not 32, I'm sorry. So, yes, the point here, we should not mix it with authority check. Yes, you're right. So the business logic, if I'm, for example, now using BOPF, I have different hooks. And if I have no business logic to validate something, then this is my actual business logic. But the aspects of authorization checks, this is done in a different place, and I should not bring everything together into one, like that function module where everything is applied. But these are just different aspects, I should not mix. Who wants to see a demo, short demo about DCL? Yeah. Nobody else. I'm sorry. Very short demo. Very short demo. So we do have now, for example, the app which we started with, the read-only app. And I have my CDS view again. And now I create here, via the core data services, because the DCL is also CDS, an access control artifact.
I have one question.
Very good question. OData v4 is currently not yet supported. It's our vision, which I have shown for OData v4, that we connect OData v4 now. It's very tightly coupled for us with the programming model. Gateway offers already OData v4, and you can implement this MPC DPC stuff, but the end-to-end story from UI to the backend is currently not yet supported for the complete programming model. Because it's not just the protocol, because everything has to work together. Only then we want to release it. So access control, new artifact. And what do I want to do? I maybe want to restrict something. I want to restrict, let's say, the company name. The sales orders, restrict sales orders by status. Okay, by authorized status only. So, and now I get an artifact created with some defaulting, which defines a role, and where I can see here grant select on what? Well, on the CDS view. Where, and now I get here also auto-completion, where, for example, company name, which does not make too much sense now, is SAP. I'm not really creative this late afternoon, I'm sorry. So, and you can see here that you also have other options. So, like I said, you can link it to a PFCG object. So, like this. To be honest, I've never done it, but you will probably find it in the documentation that you can also use here PFCG objects. And then you never have to keep in mind which artifact, which PFCG object to use for which table or view, because it's always connected to this view. And now I extended or restricted the result set of this one via this hard-coded value. Of course, you would never hard-code the values. It would be part of this administration step to provide these authorization values. But we could do it, and we will see here in the demo application sales order item analysis that if I now refresh the UI, I hopefully just see SAP entries. So this is done now, done automatically by OpenSQL under the hood. Yes, please.
But in the CDS, you have also an authorization. Like on 3, what I just saw, where you will not require.
Yes. I can also define here on the CDS view what I expect from the CDS view as a double check. So if I put not required here, then it is not really required, but you can add a DCL. You could also say no check, then no DCL can be created, or you can, I don't know what are the values here. This is some kind of redundant, but it's also checks. So for example, also privileged only here, that I can only access the data privileged, and these are the fields which I can use. But I would like, if it's okay, maybe we can discuss it later, go into detail about the roadmap and the outlook, because some open words now at the beginning. You can imagine that creating such an application programming model is a huge task, and because you also need to have something in order to create something, you maybe need to take what you have. So for example, if you have BOPF as the framework, the state-of-the-art framework for creating business objects, and if you have CDS, and if you have Gateway as a programming model to support OData services, then the best thing you could do is to integrate these technologies and to provide a programming model based on that. But what we did internally is we set up a project where we consolidated the programming model and where we just said, well, if I'm now standing here in the year 2025, what would I like to show to you? What would be the future of our programming model? Based on these discussions, we extracted 3 things which we are currently considering. And the first thing is, I think that's also a question which always comes up in the hands-on sessions, It's very nice with BOPF. I can do their new development with determinations and validations. But what happens now if I have already my function modules? How can I integrate them? Because I cannot completely refactor my function modules and split that in validations and determinations. But how can I integrate that? Would be a very good question. The answer would be, we will see probably, hopefully next year. So far, not supported. Second thing is, like I said, the stack of existing technologies, you sometimes see that they not really originally designed for this purpose. So for example, we generate out of the CDS-BO structure, we generate the BOP metadata. So why do we generate something? Because BOPF expects and requires this metadata. If we would have designed it differently from the very first beginning on, it would probably look a little bit different. So therefore, we have two things, this end-to-end support and these evolutionary improvements. So first of all, very important for us, we will just offer, we just want to have Eclipse-based tools and no SAP GUI tools for the future. So if you're interested in ABAP and SAP TechEd, this might be a very important topic for you. We also want to support extensibility and verticalization in the future out of the box with our programming model. And evolutionary improvements, that's besides the first aspect, the integration, is it our focus topic, that we do not want to generate things based on other things, because generation means redundancy, and redundancy can result in inconsistencies, as we all know. So therefore we want to avoid it whenever possible. Second thing, if you are a little bit familiar with BOPF or with other frameworks, then you know that these frameworks either use some code generation, like Gateway Service Builder. It generates code. Why? Because Service Builder wants to offer typed APIs, that you have static checks. You only get that by a framework if you generate code. Second approach would be to have a generic API. That means you are implementing untyped, which means you don't have static checks, but runtime issues. That means you are having conceptually a static issue, but you just recognize it at runtime because you might use a different or wrong constant or something like that. So therefore, our approach is to avoid generic implementations without code generation. This is only possible for us in ABAP because we own the language and we can change the language and extend the language. So like OpenSQL, you don't need code generation, but you also do implement in a typed way. And in other ways, in other areas, it's not possible. BOPF was never able to use this approach, either generate something or it is generic. Yes, please.
Sorry, just because I said it's only possible in ABAP if you support Haskell as a language. There is a thing called template Haskell, and you could do exactly that.
For us, at SAP, it's currently only possible in ABAP. Yes, thank you. So, and then something else which we want to address is that the business object concept which we have, that this gets a native support in our language. That means it gets a first-class citizen which is even known to the DEDIC and which is known to the ABAP language. So, and our project is called RESTful ABAP Programming Model, which we also use the abbreviation RAP for, which has basically 3 layers. From a conceptual point of view, the first layer, having probably the most artifacts, is the data and behavior definition layer. It's basically the universe, so like in former times the DEDIC and function model universe, the universe of all the models and the according business logic. And then the service definition is the conceptual artifact to define which parts of my universe should be exposed for my role-based app or for my role-based service. And the service binding defines then which kind of protocol should be used to expose this defined service. And why are we doing that? So first of all, like I said, we are currently generating based on CDS this BOPF metadata, and we don't have, at least for this stack here, these typed signatures, and we want to change that by bringing the modeling of the behavior of a business object into the core development, into the ABAP language and into the DDIC. That means we have three things. First of all, the BO structure, defined via CDS with some extensions which are related to the BO, like a composition, like root, no annotations anymore, but CDS syntax, which can also be checked statically. Second thing, the behavior of a business object, and the behavior says create, yes, delete, update, and which actions are provided. And the third thing is the runtime. And the runtime is now depending on your implementation scenario, can be a generically provided runtime with determinations and validations you can implement, or it could be a create, update, delete method which you can implement by your own by calling some function modules. So these are the three things which we have in the business object: the structure, the behavior, and also the runtime. And the behavior is defined in a CDS-like artifact, the behavior definition language, where you can, in a declarative way, define how it looks like. So, and regarding the OData service, we have also a significant change here. So, I have shown always a demo with OData published true, which is good for demos, which is good for analytical scenarios, which is not really recommended for transactional scenarios, because you normally would use the SCGW, reference data source concept, gateway service builder, reference data source, and you would simply say which CDS views of your universe should be exposed to OData, and based on that, you can then create an OData service. In addition, you have many other transactions. So one very good transaction which tries to have a bracket around the functionalities in main service, gateway main service transaction, but there are also different other transactions. So the problem here is that we don't have a very clear flow or reuse of this service definition here. Therefore, we want to change that by introducing Eclipse only editors for these two artifacts, which is the service definition. In the service definition, I just say which CDS views of my universe should be exposed to OData and which not. And then, once I define that in CDS, which should be exposed, with the corresponding metadata extensions, because UI annotations are always UI specific, application specific, I define it also on this level here. This one can be exposed then by the service binding by defining the protocol to, for example, now OData v2, OData v4 in the future. So the end-to-end programming model will then in the future look like that. We will offer different types of CDS artifacts, which you can also implement without database. So I want to implement a transient node for this object, something where the values are calculated in ABAP, because I read them via from the application server or via C or somewhere else. And I can implement a CDS artifact also via ABAP coding. And independent how these are implemented, I can attach then this behavior, like action determinations, validations, or my self-implemented function module I can plug in here. We will offer probably a test shell where I can test then my business object, similar to the test shell of BOPF. And then on top, we have the service definition, which I mentioned, and we have the service binding. And within the service binding, we currently have the first successful concept for that, is we want to offer a smart template preview, Fiori elements preview. Why? Because what was the reason that I jumped? I'm pretty much backend developer, so why need I to go to the web IDE just in order to display the results that I've done in backend? So the idea is to have a Fiori elements preview only, also in Eclipse, in our tool, to show the result of the service which I have created. And then, of course, someone else can do in the web IDE, the UI developer, extend the UI or implement the real UI using Fiori elements breakouts to implement the additional coding, and can do the rest, but you could also compare it then with the preview in the backend only to see what is done. So, are there any further questions from your side? No, I would then only have the last slide, which is the roadmap for us. So currently, in 2018, we are focusing pretty much on HX services, on cloud integration, and we want to go ahead with OData v4 and want to provide OData clients, so which is very important. If you might have heard about ABAP in SAP, so ABAP in SAP, so the question comes up: how can I now, in a convenient way, consume, for example, OData v4, OData S4HANA services? So OData services from S4HANA, because if I'm now creating an extension of S4HANA, I also need to access S4HANA in a convenient way. Therefore, we do not need only the provisioning of OData services, but also the consumption of OData services, which is not calling the CL HTTP handler and doing the CSRF token handling by your own, but having a convenient API like the Gateway API for provisioning, also for the consumption. And then we will also go ahead with support for the supportability and development efficiency, and exactly the point which I mentioned: how can I integrate my existing code into this programming model to benefit also from this, to have a draft support without rebuilding everything, but just including what I have already. And in the future, we also think about very interesting other topics. So, having said that, I think we can come to an end of the session. Thank you for waiting to the end. And I think you enjoyed the TechEd here, and I hope you have a safe trip back, and thank you very much for listening and for joining.